Ruth Calloway found water at 12 feet because she had been watching the trees for 3 years. Not watching them the way people watch trees, which was the watching of people who notice trees as background, as the green vertical elements of a landscape that registered as pleasant or not pleasant, and then receded from attention. She watched them the way a person watched something they were trying to understand, with the sustained, focused attention that produced, over time, the specific kind of knowledge that was different from learned knowledge, because it came from the thing itself, rather than from a description of the thing. The trees she watched were cottonwoods, 3 of them on the east side of the property she had bought 4 years ago in the high desert of eastern New Mexico, a 40-acre parcel of land that sat between 2 failed homesteads and that had been on the market for 11 years before she bought it for the price of land that nobody wanted, which was a price she could manage, and a price that was the specific proof that nobody had looked at it carefully enough. She had bought it at 58 years old with the settlement money from a marriage that had ended after 23 years and that had produced, in addition to 2 adult children and a complicated grief, the specific clarity of a woman who had been arranging her life around someone else's priorities for 2 decades, and who had arrived at 58 with the understanding that the remaining years were going to be arranged around her own. Her own priorities included land. She had grown up on a small farm in the Texas Panhandle before the farm had been sold, and before the life that replaced it had been the life she had moved through for 30 years. The life of cities and careers, and the marriage and the children, and the specific erosion of the person she had been before all of that had happened. She had not forgotten that person. She had kept the knowing of land the way she kept certain other things, in the part of herself that was not available to the erosion. And when the marriage ended and the settlement arrived, she had understood what she was going to do with it. In the way you understood things you had always known, but had not previously had the conditions to act on. She had bought the 40 acres in eastern New Mexico and had gone to live on it. The land was dry. She had known it would be dry because she had researched the region and understood the annual precipitation figures and what they meant for a person trying to make something productive from 40 acres in the high desert. The dryness was not a surprise. It was a condition she had bought the land knowing about and that she had a plan for, which was the plan of drilling a well. The first driller had come in the 3rd month. His name was Carl Jessup, and he had been drilling wells in eastern New Mexico for 30 years, and he had looked at the property and the land and the existing data from the area, and had said he would put the well at the northwest corner where the county hydrogeology maps showed the best likelihood of a productive aquifer. He had drilled 60 feet. He had found nothing. He had told her, with the professional regret of someone who had given people bad news about water before, and who understood that water in this country was not a given, that the aquifer was either not present at this location or was deeper than his equipment could reach efficiently, and that the cost of going deeper was a cost he wanted her to understand before she committed to it. She had thanked him and paid him, and he had left, and she had sat on the tailgate of her truck in the northwest corner of the property in the late afternoon and looked at the dry land and the drill hole and thought about what she was going to do. She had done what she usually did when she needed to think about something important. She had watched the trees. The cottonwoods were at the east end of the property, 200 yards from the dry wash that formed the eastern boundary. They were mature trees, which meant they had been there for at least 20 years, and possibly longer. And they were alive in the way that cottonwoods in the high desert were alive when they had what they needed, which was water, which was available to them in the specific way that cottonwoods accessed it, which was through roots that went deep and found the water table and drew from it directly. She had known this when she bought the property. She had known that cottonwoods did not establish themselves in the high desert without a reason, and that the reason was water, and that 3 mature cottonwoods on a 40-acre parcel meant that the water table was accessible in the area where they stood. She had not known how deep or how productive or what the drilling would require, but she had known the trees were telling her something. The northwest corner where Carl Jessup had drilled was 260 yards from the cottonwoods. She had not overridden his assessment at the time, because she had been new to the land and had been willing to defer to the experience of someone who had been drilling in the region for 30 years. She understood, sitting on the tailgate after he left, that deferring had been the correct thing to do when the question was a geological one and he was the geological expert, but that she had information he had not weighed because he had not been watching the trees. She spent the following morning walking the east side of the property. She walked it the way she had been walking the property for 3 years, which was the way she had been watching the trees, with the specific attention of someone who was trying to understand rather than trying to confirm. She walked from the cottonwoods toward the dry wash, and from the dry wash toward the cottonwoods, and along the line between them, and away from the line, and back to it. She was looking at the ground. The ground told things if you looked at it with the attention required. She had learned this on the Texas Panhandle farm before she had learned anything else about land. The way the surface expression of what was underground was readable if you knew what you were reading. The slight variations in the color of the soil that reflected differences in moisture at depth. The specific plant communities that grew where particular conditions existed and did not grow where those conditions were absent. The topography, which in this country was subtle but present. The low draws and the slight rises that directed the movement of water when water moved, and that indicated, if you had watched long enough, where the water went when it stopped moving and settled. She had been watching for 3 years. She had the notebook she had kept from the first month on the property, the observations about the cottonwoods and the plant communities around them, and the specific colors of the soil in different sections of the east end, and the behavior of the ground after the occasional rains that came through, and what the behavior told her about what was beneath. She spent the morning and the early afternoon walking and looking and testing her observations against each other and against the notebook. And at the end of the early afternoon, she stood in a specific place on the east side of the property and looked at the ground beneath her feet. She was 23 feet from the nearest cottonwood. She looked at the soil. The color was slightly different here, a shift toward the darker end of the desert soil spectrum that was subtle enough to be missed by someone not looking for it, and that she had noted in the notebook 14 months ago and had been watching since. The plants in this immediate area included 2 species that she had looked up after noticing them, species that were known to be present in areas with higher soil moisture availability. The topography was a very slight depression, barely perceptible, the kind of low point that collected rather than shed. She pushed a metal rod into the ground. The rod was a fence post driver rod she had been using for this purpose for 2 years. driving it into the ground at different locations and noting the resistance at different depths, which was a crude measure, but an informative one when you did it consistently enough to compare the results. At 12 inches, the resistance changed. Not gone, changed. The specific change that indicated the soil composition was different at depth than at the surface. The change she associated with the transition zone she had been tracking across the east end of the property. She made a note. She came back the following morning and drove the rod at 12 points in the area around where she had stood. 8 of the 12 showed the same resistance change at approximately the same depth. She came back the following week with a soil probe she had borrowed from the county agricultural extension and took cores at 6 points. The cores from 4 of the 6 points showed the specific soil characteristics she had been reading about in the months she had been trying to understand what she was seeing. The characteristics associated with the capillary fringe above a shallow water table, the zone where the moisture from below was present in the soil without the soil being saturated. She called a hydrogeologist. The hydrogeologist's name was Dr. Patricia Wells, and she was in her mid-40s and had the specific quality of a scientist who had spent her career in a field where the work was done in the ground and who had the outdoor competence and the patience for detail that field work over many years produced. She came on a Thursday in October, 3.5 years after Ruth had first watched the Cottonwoods. Ruth walked her through the east end of the property. She showed her the cottonwoods and the specific plant species she had noted, and the soil color variation, and the probe results, and the cores, and the notebook with 3.5 years of observations. Dr. Wells walked the area. She stopped at the same location where Ruth had made her first significant observation. She spent 20 minutes examining the soil and the plant community and the topography and taking her own notes. She looked at Ruth's notebook for a long time. She said Ruth had been doing systematic field observation. Ruth said she had been watching the land. Dr. Wells said there was a significant amount of systematic field observation in the notebook. Ruth said she had needed to understand what she was looking at. Dr. Wells said the observations were consistent with the presence of a shallow, perched aquifer in the area Ruth had identified. She said a perched aquifer was an aquifer that sat above the main regional water table, held in place by an impermeable layer that prevented it from draining to depth, and that they occurred in the high desert in specific geological conditions that included the right kind of subsurface geology in the right configuration. She said the northwest corner of the property, where the first driller had gone to 60 feet, was 260 yards from this location. Ruth said yes. Dr. Wells said the hydrogeology maps that would have informed the first driller's decision were regional maps that did not capture the local variation. Ruth said the maps had not shown this. Dr. Wells said the maps had not shown this because the scale of the maps was not the scale of a perched aquifer, which was a local feature rather than a regional one. Ruth said she had been watching the trees. Dr. Wells looked at the cottonwoods. She said cottonwoods were reliable indicators. She said they did not establish in the high desert without a reason, and that the reason was always water. Ruth said she knew. Dr. Wells said she would like to do a resistivity survey to confirm the aquifer location and depth before recommending a drill point. Ruth said she would appreciate that. The resistivity survey took 2 days the following week. Dr. Wells worked with an instrument that sent electrical signals into the ground and measured the resistance at different depths, and translated the resistance data into a picture of the subsurface geology. She came to Ruth at the end of the second day with the data. She said the perched aquifer was present. She said it was at a depth of between 10 and 14 feet in the area Ruth had identified. She said the resistivity data suggested the aquifer was productive, which was not a guarantee, but was the specific technical assessment that distinguished an aquifer that would yield usable water from one that was technically present but not practically accessible. She said the drill point she would recommend was almost exactly where Ruth had been standing when she had made her first probe measurement. Ruth said that was 23 feet from the nearest cottonwood. Dr. Wells said yes. Ruth said she had stood there because the soil color was different. Dr. Wells said the soil color was different because the capillary fringe effect was more pronounced there than in the surrounding area. Ruth said she had noticed the plants. Dr. Wells said the plants Ruth had identified were known phreatophytes in this region. Ruth said she had looked them up. Dr. Wells said she knew. She had read the notebook. The second driller came in November. His name was David Marsh, and he was younger than Carl Jessup had been, and had the quality of someone who had learned his trade recently enough that he was still bringing his full attention to what the ground was telling him, rather than relying entirely on what his experience told him to expect. Ruth told him the drill point. He looked at the resistivity data Dr. Wells had provided. He said the data supported the drill point. Ruth said she had identified the drill point from observation before the data was collected. He looked at her. She said she had been watching the Cottonwoods. He said he would drill at the identified point. He drilled. At 8 feet, the drill rate changed. The specific change in drill behavior that indicated the bit had passed through a transition zone. At 10 feet, the drill brought up wet soil. At 12 feet, the drill hit water. David Marsh stopped the drill. He looked at Ruth. He said 12 feet. She said yes. He said the first drill was at 60 feet and found nothing. She said yes. He said she had found water at 12 feet by watching trees. She said she had found it by watching the trees and the soil and the plant community and the topography for 3.5 years. He said he had been drilling wells in this country for 8 years. She said she knew. He said he had never drilled a well at 12 feet. She said she had not known how deep it would be. She had known approximately where it would be. He said how. She said the cottonwoods were the beginning. She said they were the indicator that the water was accessible somewhere in that end of the property. She said the soil color variation had narrowed the location. She said the plant species had confirmed it. She said the topography had supported it. She said the probe resistance had identified it. She said she had been putting information together for 3.5 years. He looked at the cottonwoods. He said most people would have drilled where the maps said to drill. She said the maps were regional. He said most people would have drilled again when the first one came up dry. She said she had not wanted to drill again until she understood where to drill. He said 3.5 years was a long time to wait for water. She said she had been hauling water from town in the meantime. He said that was a lot of hauling. She said she had a truck. He looked at her. She said the land had been telling her where the water was since she arrived. She said she had needed to learn to read it. He said most people didn't take the time. She said most people didn't have 3.5 years and the specific motivation of needing to know. He finished the well. The well produced at a rate that Dr. Wells, when Ruth sent her the pump test results, described as excellent for a perched aquifer of this type and more than sufficient for household and small-scale agricultural use. Ruth stood at the wellhead on the November morning when the pump test was complete and the water was flowing, and the specific fact of water on the property was real rather than planned. She looked at the Cottonwoods. They were doing what they had always been doing, which was being cottonwoods in the high desert, with their roots in the water that she had found by watching them. She thought about 3.5 years of hauling water from town in the truck, and 3.5 years of walking the east end of the property, and 3.5 years of the notebook with its observations, and the probe measurements, and the cores, and Dr. Wells with the resistivity equipment, and David Marsh with the drill. She thought about 60 feet of dry hole in the northwest corner. She thought about the maps that showed the regional water table, and not the local perched aquifer that had been sitting under the cottonwoods at 12 feet since before anyone had drilled a dry hole anywhere near it. She thought about the things that land told you if you watched it with the patience that it required, which was the patience of the land's own time, rather than the patience of a person who wanted results by a schedule of their own devising. The land had told her. She had listened. The water ran. She went inside to make tea.